Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take a towering stack of specialized sources, distill the critical insights, and give you the fastest, smartest way to understand a complex issue. Today, we are diving into a foundational source material of Islam, second only to the Qur'an itself. We're talking about the Hadith.
That's right, the sayings, the actions, the silent approvals of the Prophet Muhammad.
And for you, our listener, we're unpacking the biggest challenges. The historical, methodological, and yes, the political paradoxes that surround this monumental collection of texts.
And we're starting right at the core paradox, what you could call the gap. If the Hadith are the essential how-to guide for interpreting the Qur'an.
The user manual, so to speak.
Exactly. Then why was this crucial material left to, fallible human memory for nearly a century and a half?
Well, the Qur'an was written down immediately, protected, and systematized from day one. It's a huge question.
A massive one.
So we're going to track this puzzle through three key lenses. The traditional Sunni scholarly response, the specific critique from Shia scholars, and the external analysis from modern academics.
And we'll examine the incredible science that was developed centuries later to try and authenticate all of it.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The delay.
Right. The sources are pretty clear that a really systematic state-sponsored effort to compile these traditions. It didn't get going until the time of Caliph Umar ibn Abdulaziz.
And that's around 100 AH or 717 CE.
About that, yeah. But the famous collections, the big ones we rely on today, they didn't really show up until the golden age of scholarship.
Which was, 250 years after the events they're describing?
Exactly. So that 150-year gap, that's the core issue we have to tackle.
Okay, so right away that leads to the first big controversy.
Yeah.
Why the wait? The sources actually have conflicting reports about whether the Prophet himself prohibited writing down hadith.
Which sounds strange, right? Why forbid something that's supposed to be binding? Well, the common defense, especially within the Sunni tradition, is that the prohibition was temporary. It was all about prudence.
Prudence in what way?
The fear was that people, especially early on, would accidentally confuse the Prophet's own explanatory, inspired words, the hadith, with the verbatim eternal word of God.
The Qur'an.
The Qur'an. The absolute priority was to get the Qur'an secured, perfectly, physically, immutably. Only then could you move on to that secondary layer of guidance.
Okay, that's one perspective. But the Shia tradition offers a much sharper, more political explanation.
Oh, absolutely. For Shia scholars, this supposed prohibition was actually a form of political manipulation.
Manipulation by who?
By the first caliphs to sideline the Prophet's designated familial successors, the imams. They argue the Prophet did dictate comprehensive records.
Things like the famous Book of Ali.
Exactly. And that these texts were preserved and passed down by the infallible imams, but they were suppressed by political rivals. It completely reframes the delay.
So it wasn't divine prudence, it was political exclusion.
That's the argument.
That immediately raises the stakes on who has the authority to transmit this knowledge. But, okay, whatever the reason for the delay, we have to talk about the reliance on memory. We're talking about a 150-year oral chain. It's spanning generations, continents, to a modern mind that just sounds scientifically unreliable.
And that's where the traditionalists say the comparison is just flawed. We're applying a 21st century mindset to a 7th century culture that was profoundly, deeply oral.
What does that mean in practice?
It means Arab culture, especially among the educated, had a prodigious memory. They were professionally trained to preserve huge amounts of information, epic poems, genealogies, histories, with near verbatim accuracy.
So they're arguing that their method wasn't flawed, it was actually superior.
For its time, yes. They'd say that oral transmission combined with the living, continuous practice of the community,
The Sunnah.
that this was seen as more flexible and reliable than just relying on, brittle scrolls that could be isolated or lost. It was a practiced communal memory.
That idea of communal practice, or amal, seems really important here. Our sources point out that early jurists like Imam Malik in Medina, he often relied on what the people of Medina were actually doing.
Yes. He saw that as a stronger connection to the Prophet's time than, say, an isolated hadith report that might be filtering in from somewhere far away.
So for him, the living tradition was stronger evidence than a single textual report.
It's a fascinating way of prioritizing, isn't it? For Malik, what the community closest to the Prophet's center was doing, that was the gold standard. It suggests that for the big legal issues, these textual reports weren't always the first or only source of law.
So when did that change? When did the text become paramount?
It became absolutely necessary when the Islamic world just exploded in size. The living chains of witnesses thinned out, and critically, the risk of forgery went through the roof.
And once that expansion happened, the floodgates for forgery just opened.
Oh, absolutely. It's universally acknowledged, even by traditional scholars, that wad al-hadith, or forgery, was rampant. For political reasons, legal reasons, theological reasons.
Which brings up a really tough question. Why would a tradition meant to be a divine guide be so vulnerable to mass corruption?
The counter-argument is that the forgery crisis is actually proof that tradition was self-regulating. The fact that we have these huge, detailed lists of known forgeries, like Ibn al-Jawzi's famous book of fabricated hadith, is seen as proof that the self-cleansing mechanism worked.
So the capacity to detect the forgeries is the real sign of divine guidance.
That's the traditional view. The disease necessitated the cure, and the cure was proof of the system's strength.
Okay, so let's talk about that cure, the detection system, the isnad.
The famous chain of custody.
Yeah.
Narrated by X, who heard from Y, who heard from Z. It's the core verification tool.
But the timing is suspicious. Why does this system only seem to appear after these huge political conflicts, like the first fitna, the big civil war around 680 CE? Doesn't that suggest the isnads were just made up after the fact to give legitimacy to certain stories?
The traditional response is a bit more subtle than that. They argue the fitna, the civil war, wasn't the cause of the isnad, but the catalyst.
What's the difference?
The chaos and sectarianism forced scholars to become hypervigilant. It led to the command, "Name us your men." The isnad was a defensive reaction you needed to verify sources when basic trust in society had collapsed.
Like demanding a chain of custody for evidence in a modern court case during a time of crisis.
Exactly. But the critical academic view from people like Joseph Schacht is very different. He argued many hadiths are what he called back projections.
Back projections.
Later legal or theological rulings that were created by a community, and then, to give them prophetic authority, a perfect-looking isnad was just fabricated backward in time all the way to the prophet.
But it looks perfect, but it's a retroactive stamp of approval.
Precisely. And that leads you right to the issue of state influence. The Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs were sponsoring these first big collections.
Right. If the government's funding the research, how can you be sure the content wasn't curated? Maybe emphasizing hadith that tell you to obey the ruler no matter what.
A huge concern. Scholars insist that key figures like al-Zuri maintain their independence, and crucially, that the science developed later, Jarh wa Ta'dil, was designed specifically to filter out those kinds of political biases.
Which brings us to the authentication engine itself.
The heart of the matter, and to really get it, you have to look at the numbers. Take al-Bukhari, the most revered compiler. He's said to have examined something like 600,000 traditions.
Wait, 600,000 traditions? That number alone suggests the volume of weak or just plain false material must have been overwhelming.
It was overwhelming, but it was rigorously managed. Out of those 600,000, he accepted only about 7,000 for his canonical collection, the Sahih.
So, that's a rejection rate of what, 99%?
Roughly, yeah, a 99% rejection rate.
But doesn't that prove the oral tradition was fundamentally unreliable to begin with?
The traditionalist argument is an emphatic no. It proves the system was meticulously discriminating. That 600,000 number is misleading. It's not 600,000 unique lies.
So what is it?
It includes massive redundancy, the exact same text transmitted through dozens of different chains, some with slight faults. It includes minor variations, repetitions. The 7,000 that made the cut represent the absolute highest possible confidence level. It proves rigor, not chaos.
And the mechanism for that rigor was this science of men, Jarh wa Ta'dil. So how does that even work? If you're a scholar in the 9th century, how do you judge the piety and memory of a narrator who died 150 years before you were even born?
It was an incredible historical investigation. They were like detectives. They tracked every narrator's life. When did they travel? Who did they meet? Did they even live at the same time as their supposed teacher?
Ah, so it's about provable historical connection, not just judging someone's character.
Exactly. If narrator X claims he heard from teacher Y, but records show Y died before X was born, that chain is instantly broken, rejected. They'd also cross-reference memory. If one student's version of a hadith was consistently different from all the other students of the same teacher, his memory would be flagged as weak.
But that leads to a classic philosophical problem: circular reasoning. Is it possible they were using the hadith to validate the character of the very people who transmitted those hadiths?
It's a fair critique, and it's a risk. But the defense is that they weren't only relying on the hadith texts. They use a ton of external data biographies, communal reputation, historical records.
So the sheer scale of the network was a defense against that.
Yes. If you have thousands of different sources, neighbors, other students, jurists, all confirming someone's reputation and timeline, it's very hard for one small manufactured loop of text to corrupt that whole network.
There's also this tension in the methodology itself, right? Between the chain, the isnad, and the actual text, the matan.
A major tension. Traditional scholars really prioritize the chain. If the chain is perfect, the text is authentic. Period.
But reformists push back on that. They ask, why was textual criticism, matan criticism, often secondary? If a hadith flatly contradicts the Qur'an or a known scientific fact, shouldn't it be rejected no matter how beautiful the chain looks?
And that's a debate that is very much alive today. Traditionalists fear that using subjective human logic could lead to people rejecting true prophetic statements just because they seem strange or difficult.
While the reformist view is that the Qur'an has to be the ultimate yardstick.
Exactly. Any hadith that violates the Qur'an's core message has to be questioned, even with a strong-looking chain.
So once this huge body of material is collected, its legal authority then has to be formalized. Which brings us to al-Shafi'i in the early 9th century. Why did he feel the need to argue so forcefully for the authority of hadith?
Well, traditionalists would say he didn't invent its authority, he systematized it. He was the one who formalized the argument that obeying the messenger, the sunnah, is a direct command from the Qur'an.
And who was he arguing against?
He was responding to regional legal schools that were starting to prioritize local traditions or even just pure human reason over specific prophetic reports. He basically standardized the methodology, making hadith the central legislative tool for the whole Muslim world.
And that systematization really crystallized the biggest divide in the faith today. Why do the major Sunni collections and the major Shia collections, like Kitab al-Kafi, have such different sets of authentic narrations?
It boils down to a fundamental disagreement on who you can trust as a source.
Okay.
The Sunni tradition generally accepts the reliability of the vast majority of the Prophet's companions, the Sahaba. They're all considered upright and trustworthy transmitters.
And the Shia position is not that.
Not at all. They argue that the Sunni transmission channels were fundamentally compromised by political figures who opposed the Prophet's family. So the Shia tradition trusts only the imams and those who narrated directly from them. It's a total split over the reliability of the witnesses.
This whole dense 250-year history, the delay, the politics, the retroactive authentication, it brings us back to that external academic critique. When people like Goldziher look at this whole thing, what's their conclusion?
They tend to view the Hadith corpus as a profoundly human institution, a reflection of how early Muslim communities evolved their identity, solved their legal problems, and then retroactively attributed those solutions to the Prophet to give them universal legitimacy.
So it's a mirror of the first 2 centuries of Islamic history, not necessarily a perfect window into the Prophet's time.
That's the argument. But of course, modern Muslim scholars like M.M. Azami push back hard on that, defending the isnad system as an unparalleled method of historical verification for its time. Far more advanced, they'd say, than anything in the secular world for centuries.
So after all of this, what does it all mean for you, the listener?
I think this deep dive shows that the Hadith corpus is not some single, simple book. It's a monumental human achievement, historical, scholarly, political. It was filtered through memory, tested by conflict, and subjected to a really rigorous science centuries later. The complexity is part of its story.
And the key takeaway seems to be that the tradition itself is vibrant. The fact that all these critical orphans exist and that there are such detailed, layered responses from every side, Sunni, Shia, academic, that proves this material is constantly being audited. It's not a closed, unquestioning dogma.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. Given the acknowledged history of political influence and mass forgery that made the whole isnad system necessary in the first place, which perspective provides the most trustworthy guide for today? Is it the traditional emphasis on the chain, the isnad, as the ultimate proof of authenticity? Or is it the reformist focus on the text itself, the matn, and its consistency with the Qur'an and with reason? That's a question worth mulling over long after this deep dive is complete.